First 2022 special session of the Portland City Council. Keelan, good morning. Please call the roll.
Good morning, Mayor. Good morning, Commissioners. Rubio.
Here.
Ryan.
Here.
Hardesty.
Here.
Maps.
Here.
Wheeler.
Here, under Portland City Code and state law, the City Council is holding this meeting electronically. All members of the council are attending remotely by video and teleconference, and the city has made several avenues available to the public to listen to the audio broadcast of this meeting. This meeting is available to the public on the city's YouTube channel, eGovPDX, www.portlandoregon.gov/video, as well as channel 30. The public may also provide written testimony to the council by emailing our council clerk at cctestimony@portlandoregon.gov. The council is taking these steps as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and the need to limit in-person contact and to promote physical distancing. This pandemic is an emergency that threatens the public health, safety, and welfare, which requires us to meet remotely by electronic communications. Thank you for your patience, your flexibility, and your understanding as we continue to manage through these circumstances to conduct the city's business. With that, we'll hear from legal counsel on the rules of order and decorum. Good morning.
Good morning, Mayor. To participate in council meetings, you may sign up in advance with the Council Clerk's Office for Communications to briefly speak about any subject. You may also sign up for public testimony on resolutions, reports, or the first readings of ordinances. The published council agenda at www.portland.gov/council/agenda contains information about how and when you may sign up for testimony while City Council is holding electronic meetings. Your testimony should address the matter being considered at the time. When testifying, please state your name for the record. Your address is not necessary. Please disclose if you are a lobbyist. If you are representing an organization, please identify it. The presiding officer determines the length of testimony. Individuals generally have 3 minutes to testify unless otherwise stated. When your time is up, the presiding officer will ask you to conclude. Disruptive conduct, such as shouting, refusing to conclude your testimony when your time is up, or interrupting others' testimony or council deliberations will not be allowed. If there are disruptions, a warning will be given that further disruption may result in the person being placed on hold or ejected from the remainder of the electronic meeting. Please be aware that all City Council meetings are recorded.
Thank you. Colleagues, we have one item this morning, item number 59, please, Keelan.
Accept the Portland Police Bureau report to City Council on the 2022 Portland Joint Terrorism Task Force.
Colleagues, last week when I learned of several unanswered questions that council had asked regarding this report, I pulled the item back to my office. The Police Bureau has worked to answer many of these questions which have been included in the revised report. This is the third annual report from the Police Bureau regarding PPB's cooperation with the Joint Terrorism Task Force following the formal withdrawal from the task force in May of 2019. City Council Resolution 37424 details the parameters of that engagement and cooperation. Part of that is also this annual report to the City Council. Just from a housekeeping perspective, we should be aware of the fact there are several different kinds of reports. What is actually specified in the council resolution is a presentation to council, meaning there would not be a motion, a second, a vote, or public testimony. But I think there's been great confusion this year. There are a number of people who have signed up for the report. So if there is no objection, what I'd like to do is treat this like a regular report presentation, meaning we will hear public testimony. And I understand we have a number of people signed up. I will then ask for a motion and a second and take a vote to accept this report if there's no objection from any of my colleagues on the council today. And I don't see anybody looking like they object. We have Chief Lavelle and Sergeant Pete Simpson with us today to present the report and answer any additional questions council may have on the topic. So with that, welcome Chief Lavelle and Sergeant Simpson. I'll turn this over to you. Good morning.
Good morning, Mayor. Thank you for having us this morning. Thank you for scheduling this and letting us be a part of this presentation. I've just got a few opening remarks, and then I'm going to turn it over to Sergeant Simpson for presentation of the report. But this JTTF annual report documents the relationship between the Portland Police Bureau and the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force, as directed by City Council Resolution 37-424. This partnership follows strict guidelines and is an important component in public safety. But as chief, I feel it's important to acknowledge community concerns around the broader context of PPB's interaction and relationships with other federal government entities, particularly involving the law enforcement response to demonstrations in 2020. I understand that for many in the community, there remains unresolved questions regarding the response from law enforcement and fear of federal government overreach. In the early days of the demonstrations, PPB communicated with federal partners who were tasked with securing federal buildings in the downtown area. But as the days ran into weeks, Portland saw a surge in federal law enforcement resources, which changed the dynamics of these events and created a challenging environment for all. In mid-July of 2020, the Portland City Council unanimously voted to ban the Portland Police Bureau from working with federal law enforcement in Portland during the nightly demonstrations. From that point forward, there was no information exchange or cooperative work done between PPB and the federal law enforcement agencies until it was later clarified to allow communication and cooperation with the locally assigned federal officials. The Portland Police Bureau remains committed to transparency and accountability, including our work with federal partners. And with that, I will turn it over to Sergeant Pete Simpson for a presentation of the reports from last year.
Thank you, Chief. Good morning, members of council. This report, as required by City Council resolution, dictates that there are 4 areas that need to be reported on annually to City Council. These 4 areas are the frequency with which the FBI's special agent in charge requested the assignment of PPB CIU officers for an investigation, the number of cases that were referred to the PPB by the FBI, the number of cases that were referred to the FBI by PPB, and the nature of closed cases referred to PPB by the FBI, including the demographics of persons investigated and the disposition of those cases. It also asks that by annually, the PPB CIU members receive refresher training with the Portland City Attorney's Office on any applicable laws and federal laws that would apply to this resolution. That training did occur on January 6th, and the City Attorney's Office has advised us that there are no changes in state or federal law that would preclude PPB officers from working with the FBI's JTTF. Jumping into the 4 areas in the report, the first, the frequency with which the FBI requested assignment of PPB officers for a JTTF investigation. In 2021, there were no requests made of PPB officers to assist on an investigation with the JTTF. The next section, this number of cases that were referred to the PPB by the FBI. In 2021, there was 1 case referred to PPB. That case was reviewed by CIU investigators and investigative action was taken, which is summarized in this report. I will get to that in the 3rd section. Per City Council request, PPB reports out that there were no cases or no information shared with PPB that was based off of facial recognition. We are aware of City Council resolution regarding that matter, and that would be a non-starter for us to accept any information and act on any information based on facial recognition technologies. The 3rd section, the number of cases that were referred to the PPB, referred to the FBI by PPB. In 2021, PPB CIU referred 7 cases to the JTTF for review. The nature of these cases included a shooting at a federal facility, a bomb threat to a religious facility, an arson, a threat of targeted violence to a police officer involving a subject linked to other federal charges, a threat of targeted violence to an elected official, a bomb threat to a City of Portland bridge, and a bomb threat to a federal facility. The known demographics of the subjects involved in those cases include 1 Hispanic female and 5 white males. In 2 cases, no suspect was identified. I can go through each of these cases briefly if council wishes, or jump to the final section.
Why don't we go to the final section, and then Sergeant, if anybody has specific questions, we can take that up later.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
The final section is the nature of closed cases referred to PPB by the FBI, including demographics of persons investigated and the disposition of those cases. The FBI referred 1 case to PPB. The FBI JTTF referred 1 case to PPB last year. That case was a report of a 14-year-old who posted a statement about bringing a bomb to school on Snapchat. The FBI received the initial threat and determined that the account was linked to a Northeast Portland address near a Portland high school. An FBI agent and PPB officer contacted the child and his family at the home and determined that there was no credibility to the threat. This incident and investigation occurred on the first day of school. The subject in that case was a white male. He was identified, and that case was closed after the subject was interviewed and determined that the threat was not credible. There was 1 holdover case from the 2020 report, which was a case referred from FBI to PPB. It remained open throughout the end of that year and into the next year. This case, the complainant was a member of the faith community, is a faith leader, and reported a threat, text message threat, both to PPB and the FBI. Each referred the case to each other. Ultimately, it was determined that the likely subject of that case, of that threat, was located out of state. So FBI Portland referred that case off to FBI Tampa and closed it locally. That was from the 2020 report referred to as case 10. There were some other questions posed by council pending or after the report. The initial draft report was shared last week. Those questions and answers are contained in this report. I'm happy to summarize those or just answer specific questions about the overall report.
Thank you, Sergeant. Before we go to public testimony, we'll ask if there's any questions for the time being. Commissioner Hardesty.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Chief Lavelle and Sergeant Simpson, both for being open to additions to the report. As someone who was new to council when we first withdraw our support for the Joint Terrorism Task Force, I realized that how we present something really matters. And so I would like the next reports moving forward to actually talk about that there was a city council vote that was very intentional to withdraw Portland Police from the Joint Terrorism Task Force. And because of that vote, we have instituted parameters under which Portland Police will work with the Joint Terrorism Task Force. And not that anybody is not disclosing information, but if it's not in context, then there are assumptions made if people are just seeing this for the very first time. And it's always helpful to remind people where we started and why this report is so looked forward to by the community every year when it's actually presented. So that's some critique that I wish I'd had a chance to share with you before today, but I would really like to see that as we move forward, because the resolution didn't start the process. The process started with a city council vote withdrawing our cooperation with the Joint Terrorism Task Force. So newer colleagues may not have that background and that context. And it's important that we continue to educate both council members and the public about why we get this report. So that's my only feedback at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Any questions for right now? Seeing none. Keelan, how many people do we have signed up for public testimony?
You have 10 people signed up.
Very good. 3 minutes each. Name for the record. I'll let you facilitate, Keelan. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll call 3 people up at a time. First up, we have Michelle Stevenson, Malcolm Chaddock, and Sushma Raghavan. Michelle, are you able to unmute?
I'm able to unmute. Yes, I didn't know that I was supposed to. Do I start? Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Hello, my name is Michelle Stevenson, pronouns she, hers. I'm a community member and speak for myself. My hope is that we withdraw from the Joint Terrorism Task Force completely because it unfairly targets minority members. It allows Portland Police Bureau to skirt Oregon privacy law and use the FBI to gather information on protesters and minority community members who are not breaking the law. The positives of breaking with JTTF is that we build a more equitable policing system and we build the trust with our whole community and show good faith to racial inequity protesters and the BIPOC community. The negatives are that the PPB would lose a resource in complicated investigations. Portland has rivers of trauma from inequity. I can show those rivers in my own story, and I'm white and privileged. These stories are a part of us. They always will be, but the stories haven't ended. We are still becoming and changing every day. The future is as much a part of us as the past, and we get to choose what we do next. What we do next will inform our stories and who we are. For the story of Portland, I would hope, not for a utopia, which I don't believe exists, and not for the good old days, which I personally remember as lonely, traumatic, and dehumanizing, but as a city with more compassion and a city that is people-centered. Portland is really at a crossroads right now. We are coming out of a pandemic. We're politically divided. We have major issues with homelessness and crime. We have a poverty and livability problem, great inequity, a mental health crisis, and an addiction crisis. Our city is overwhelmed. We're tired. We need help. I think we want help. Most of us do. The easy choice is to ask for any help at any moral cost, even if that help also brings more inequity to Portland. To receive this JTTF help from the federal government has hurt our community members more than helped us. The majority of our in-your-face problems have arisen from inequity. I agree that we do need help right now, but it really matters that it is not a help that will bring more of the root problem to Portland. We are fighting so hard for true public safety that serves our community members with equality, compassion, and accountability. We have already paid such a big price as individuals and as a community for the baby steps forward we have taken. I urge Portland to not take any step back, and partnership with JTTF is 100% a step back. It isn't worth it. Thank you.
Next up, we have Malcolm Chaddock.
Good morning. Thank you for organizing this session. My name is Malcolm Chaddock. I'm current president of the Veterans for Peace chapter here in Portland. And I'm testifying to give some historical continuity to all of this, or context rather. My first day in Portland, second day in Portland, I was in front of City Council testifying on matters related to the Joint Terrorism Task Force because I had recently relocated from Fresno, California, where my first peace and social justice group, Peace Fresno, had been infiltrated by the Joint Terrorism Task Force for the area. A sheriff's deputy from Fresno County had been assigned to them and spent 6 months in meetings and traveling to protest events with our group undercover. This was a fairly shocking development at the time and was recognized as a problem internationally. The incident of the infiltration was included in Michael Moore's movie, Fahrenheit 9/11, and had Democracy Now! Episodes where that spoke of it. Over the years, this over-the-top kind of investigative and behavior, shall we say, has only continued. The cases of Muhammad, for example, who probably wouldn't have been able to do any of the things that he had originally spoken of, being helped to create the circumstances of his demise, his own demise, is only one example. And so I am here today to restate, as I have now for the last nearly 20 years, that the Joint Terrorism Task Force has its own imperatives and does not necessarily function in the best interests of the communities where they operate. And I once again would say that acceptance of the report or not, that we should move away from a further relationship with the JTTF. Thank you.
Next up, we have Sushma Raghavan.
Thank you. Good morning, Mayor Wheeler and members of the Portland City Council. Thanks for allowing me to submit my testimony today. For the record, my name is Sushma Raghavan. I'm from Unite Oregon, and we are a statewide organization dedicated to building a unified and intercultural movement for justice. I'm here today with a simple message. Portland is better off fully out of the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and I urge you to fully withdraw us from this federal partnership immediately, and not just on a case-by-case basis. The fundamental issues have not changed. Participation in the JTTF does not give the police chief, the police commissioner, the city attorney, or any other local official meaningful oversight over the officer's activities. The report has been put out that's vague, and as you all know, we've already had trouble holding law enforcement accountable in this city. We should not continue a partnership that further undermines unaccountable policing in our city. The FBI has been deputized to profile, harass, and spy on activists like those from the Black Lives Matter movement or those who protest. Federal law enforcement has targeted Muslims, immigrants, refugees, and other vulnerable members of our community. Continuing to partner with the JTTF is a clear violation of our commitment to be a sanctuary city. If you're serious about the city serving as a sanctuary, you must fully withdraw us from the JTTF. Thanks for your time.
Next up, we have Marlene Wallingford, followed by Brandon Mayfield and Mariana Garcia Medina. Marlene, are you able to unmute?
Yes. Hello. My name is Marlene Wallingford, and I am a board member of the Portland JCL. And I would like to thank the City Council for agreeing to allow testimony from the public on reports to the council. It's important that ordinary citizens have an opportunity to comment about issues that affect our daily lives. An open dialogue between city leaders and the community leads to trust and collaboration, and ultimately leads to better outcomes. I read the amended report from the Portland Police Bureau, and I'm grateful that more descriptive information was given about the kinds of cases that were shared between the two agencies. But as a member of the Portland JCL, a civil rights organization, I strongly urge the Portland Police Bureau to stop all cooperation with the Joint Terrorism Task Force. So it's ironic that although the FBI is charged with protecting the civil liberties of Americans, it has a history of violating constitutionally protected rights. Community leaders like civil rights icons Martin Luther King and Malcolm X were surveilled and followed because of their call for change was seen as threatening. Even now, according to an investigation by the New York Times published last December, agents from the FBI were dressed in plain clothes and embedded in Portland racial justice protests that followed the presidential inauguration. The newspaper's investigation found the FBI had officers in protests walking alongside activists, recording scenes of the day and alerting police to potential arrests. So the FBI's resources, should not be directed towards stopping vandalism. The U.S. Supreme Court has heard arguments in November 2021 in a case involving an FBI undercover operation at a mosque in California. Area Muslims are suing the FBI over a nearly year-long surveillance program that publicly yielded no results. The FBI is attempting to use national security as an excuse to dodge accountability, and this has deprived the plaintiffs of a chance to represent in court a mountain of evidence they say shows the FBI pursued a dragnet surveillance campaign against the Muslim community in Southern California that included secret audio and video recordings and was motivated solely by the religion of those monitored. This is no different than when in World War II, an Issei man was arrested for the now unbelievable argument that the Japanese were genetically predisposed to be loyal to Japan. Masao Yasui, father to the only Oregonian to win the Presidential Medal of Freedom, Min Yasui, was accused of planning to blow up the Panama Canal on the basis of his daughter's drawing of the canal for a school assignment. In the aftermath of 9/11, the U.S. government targeted Muslims. So we've been told that by cooperating with the agency, the Portland Police Bureau can monitor whether the agency is violating an individual's constitutionally guaranteed right to protest. There's no way our local police can have any control over FBI practices. It's time that we direct our community from an agency that has such a clouded history of upholding our constitutionally protected rights. Thank you.
Next, we have Brandon Mayfield.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Brandon Mayfield. I'm a local attorney. First of all, I want to commend the City Council and the Police Bureau for amending their 2022 report, removing some of the conclusions that gave the false impression that Muslim extremist groups overseas were the greatest threat following the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan recently, when in fact the DHS bulletin that the original report cited made it clear it was Muslim Americans that were at a greater risk from racially and ethnically motivated domestic violence extremists as a result of the withdrawal. So I commend you for that. However, at the same time, it did fail to emphasize that since 2016, most of the fatalities from terrorist attacks in this country
recording stopped
by white extremists. And as Marlene had pointed out, the federal government has.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Keelan, it sounds like the recording stopped for some reason.
Oh, thank you, Mayor. Let me go ahead and get that going.
Recording in progress.
Sorry, Brandon. Sorry about that. Go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you. As Marlene just pointed out, the federal government has a history of targeting immigrants and ethnic minorities, including Japanese Americans. And similarly, the JTTFs, which were created in the late 1990s, have historically targeted Muslims, social activist groups, as Malcolm pointed out earlier, and more recently, African Americans protesting for civil rights. I myself was personally wrongfully arrested in 2004 in connection with the Madrid, Spain bombing. I and my family were targeted by the Portland police working with the JTTF in 2004. They followed me. They gathered information about me when I came and went to a local area mosque, even though they had no evidence that I had committed any crime. And all of the reasons used in support of my false arrest were tied to my Muslim associations. The fact that I went to a local area mosque. I advertised in a Muslim yellow pages. My wife was Muslim Egyptian. surname Muhammad. So the threat to Americans by political or social activist groups like BLM or Muslims has always been virtually non-existent in terms of statistics. And for example, on average, since 1995, 50 Americans are killed in terrorist attacks worldwide. And at the same time, since 2016, 2/3 of the fatal attacks have been perpetrated by white supremacists and extremist militias. I believe the city, the state that are not focusing on where the real threat is, and to Portlanders and Oregonians, it's not Al-Qaeda or ISIS, it's drugs, gun violence, rise in white extremists. However, even the rise in the white extremist attacks and deaths does not justify compromising our civil liberties. And for that reason, I advocate, again, as I have in the past, for withdrawing completely from the JTTF, even in a case-by-case basis, or at a minimum, I think this is important, to add language to the existing resolution to ensure and allow participation on a case-by-case basis only where such investigation directly relates to criminal activity, which would make it more in keeping with ORS 181A250 and the mandates of the Fourth Amendment. So again, thank you for the opportunity to allow me to share some of my concerns. And thank you to the council members and police commissioner.
Next up, we have Mariana Garcia Medina.
Good morning, Mayor Wheeler and commissioners. Thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony on behalf of the ACLU of Oregon. My name is Mariana Garcia Medina, and I'm the Senior Policy Associate with the ACLU of Oregon. We appreciate the Mayor's Office decision last week to have the report amended with more information from the Portland Police Bureau. The new amended report has more of the information community members have asked for, including more details about the demographics of those involved, the nature of the cases, referred to the task force. This is a step towards transparency. However, the ACLU continues to have concern about the city's relationship with the JTTF. The FBI has a long history of civil rights abuses, including surveillance of lawful First Amendment activity. They have surveilled and interrogated peaceful political activists and protesters, inappropriately justifying those actions by characterizing lawful public protests as potential domestic terrorism. Time and time again, the FBI has used invasive and unconstitutional surveillance tactics in the name of counterterrorism and national security. Just last week in the New York Times, it was published a story about the FBI's purchase of a powerful spyware that is capable of reliably cracking the encrypted communications of iPhone and Android smartphones, another two of unconstitutional surveillance. This kind of surveillance operations harm community trust, disproportionately impacting historical disenfranchised community, including BIPOC and Muslim communities, as well as chill and punish protected political speech. Another concern we continue to have is Portland Police Bureau potential conflict with ORS 181A250, which the law that prevents the PPB from collecting or maintaining information about political, religious, and social views, and the association or activities of any individual as a way to protect civil liberties and privacy of Oregonians. The FBI does not operate under this law or under any comparable law or policy, and PPB officers working at the JTTF officers may be engaged in actions that are in direct conflict with ORS 181A250. The most direct way to prevent civil rights abuses and potential state law violations is for the city to prohibit PPB from participating with the JTTF. However, to the extent that the PPB continues to have engagement with the JTTF, it is critical for the city to create meaningful oversight and transparency. To do this, the city needs to continue requiring the PPB to provide consistent and timely reports with meaningful information about its activities with the JTTF. As well, the city should create a community-focused oversight structure for PPB's participation in the JTTF. Otherwise, without an oversight and transparency structure, the safeguards of ORS 181A250 and the civil rights protections of all Portlanders may be at risk. Thank you very much.
Next up, we have Simab Hussaini, Randolph Splitter, and Dan Handelman.
Hello, greetings, everybody. Would I be able to ask for 3.5 minutes? Pretty please.
Mayor?
So the answer is, I'm sorry, no. We have to give everybody the same amount of time. I
Appreciate it.
apologize for that.
No worries.
You go ahead and jump in.
Absolutely.
Thank you, sir.
I'm going to read now. Greetings and Assalamu alaikum, Mayor and respected commissioners. My name is Sima Husseini, co-founder and vice chair of the Oregon chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations, CAIR Oregon for short. This report is hot propaganda garbage. The cases referred back and forth between the two agencies makes me question, is the FBI full on and just completely JTTF now? Because I don't see the delineation here as easily. There's nothing about investigating racially motivated violence of white supremacists and groups that sympathize with their ideologies who love the city. August 22nd is a great example. Sam Adams, the mayor's office directed far right to heavily BIPOC Park Rose neighborhood where massive violence erupted. And here in downtown, a man I witnessed, motivated by that day's far right with racist intentions and political motive, brandished a weapon and fired it and was released the same evening on own recognizance. According to this report, 2021 nationally had no terrorist attacks because terrorists are following COVID protocols. I don't know what was J6 then, because I swear that involved political motives. This report cites a maybe as the Atlanta spa shooter, Robert Aaron Long as the lone lethal attack, as considered possibly terroristic. But it totally was. On May 11th, the Atlanta spa shooter received a 19-count indictment on charges including hate crimes and domestic terrorism. As someone who's also been out there in the streets during the protests, we were also able to witness a person like Garrick Fernbaugh, who's still out there. There's a kill list of Portland progressives, community leaders, and elected officials. Hello, Commissioner Hardesty. That are still out there. Anything? The depressing number of mass shootings this report downplays is not related to terrorism. Almost 700 mass shootings last year, according to the Gun Violence Archive, over 700 of them dead. But let's talk about the JTTF and the jihadist boogeymen in Portland. An imam forced to renounce his citizenship and leave the country. A store owner threatened that if he didn't sign up to be an informant on his Black Muslim community, he'd be maintained on no-fly lists. Portland businessman over a 100-day ordeal of imprisonment and torture in foreign Black sites on his way back to this country because he didn't choose to become an informant for his Portland Muslim community. A kid who was set up with a dummy bomb by the JTTF and is now in prison because his dad worried very early on and called the FBI. And they said, no case for him, as they built one over time. The diverse and uncertain threats this report states the city faces is junk science and very bad propaganda to maintain racist and xenophobic constructs in law enforcement, as we know. Constructs that have hurt my community as intended. So we ask you to read this report clearly for what it is. It's unbelievable that something like this is written and looked at as, yeah, this makes sense. Especially when this report ends with, finally, members of the community may be the first line of defense. We were and still are, and the city has given free rein to the far right, and you let the feds attack us, Mr. Mayor. Let me remind everyone about the much talked about law enforcement training slides and the furious DOJ case against the city and the police, and the mayor's own words. Let them hurt a little bit. Yeah, let's make them hurt a little bit. That's what it was. This is not an adequate report, and it's incomplete. Thank you.
Next up, we have Randolph Splitter.
Okay, can you hear me, everyone? Yes, all right, thank you. First of all, I do want to thank the commissioners, the mayor, and the police commissioner and the police sergeant, all for your public service. We know that these are challenging, difficult jobs, and we do appreciate your public service, even though we may not always agree with you. But thank you for all your work. My name is Randolph Splitter. I'm speaking today on behalf of the Portland chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace, a Jewish but also interfaith and multicultural human rights organization which focuses on equal rights for Palestinians. JVP PDX continues to oppose the Portland Police Bureau's cooperation with the Joint Terrorism Task Force because of the JTTF's long history in the aftermath of 9/11 in targeting people based on their religious and political beliefs and their country of origin. These actions contributed significantly to Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism. The role of the Federal Bureau of Investigation in running the JTTF is particularly troubling, given its even longer history of violating the civil rights and civil liberties of the American people, especially Black people, Japanese Americans, and other people of color. The Bureau's reported infiltration of Black Lives Matter protests in Portland in 2021 is just the most recent example of what has been described as the agency's culture of white supremacy. As a Jewish human rights organization, we note that the existence of JTTFs in Virginia and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, did nothing to prevent the Pittsburgh synagogue massacre or attempts by neo-Nazis to intimidate the Jewish and African American communities in Charlottesville with marches and rallies marked by racist and anti-Semitic slogans. Nor could a JTTF have anticipated the recent actions of an individual who held hostages in a Texas synagogue. The Portland ACLU has expressed concern that the JTTF entangles local police officers in practices that violate state laws protecting Oregonians from being targeted because of their political, religious, and social views. These crucial protections were put into place to safeguard our First Amendment rights. The FBI doesn't have any such prohibitions on surveillance, as their own policies no longer require, quote, reasonable suspicion to engage in intrusive investigations. That the JTTF continues to operate under a veil of secrecy with little oversight is particularly troubling considering its history of civil rights violations. We believe that the values of Portlanders, including the Jewish community, are inconsistent with keeping Portland police in a relationship with the JTTF.
Next up, we have Dan Handelman.
Good morning, Mayor Wheeler, Commissioners Hardesty, and new to these hearings, Commissioners Ryan, Maps, and Rubio. I hope you can hear me okay. My name is Dan Handelman. I'm with Peace and Justice Works and our project group, Portland Cop Watch. We would like to express deep gratitude for their ability to give oral, contemporaneous testimony on the Joint Terrorism Task Force this year. This is the first time since the new relationship was adopted in 2019 that such testimony has been heard. Despite large turnouts that year to demand the city take its officers out of the FBI's task force. The previous 2 years, our group helped organize alternate events. First with a mock city council hearing featuring empty seats and nameplates for council members in 2020, then last year with a live stream during the online council meeting. This is all part of an effort that goes back to the year 2000 when Portland Cop Watch first found the JTTF on the consent agenda and prompted council to begin raising questions about the FBI's goals. At that time, JTTF was supposed to target for prosecution those individuals or groups who were responsible for right-wing and or left-wing movements, as well as acts of the anti-abortion movement and the Animal Liberation Front / Earth Liberation Front. Then Commissioner Charlie Hales, that sounded like something from the Nixon era, and he was not wrong. In 2001, people packed City Hall, and the JTTF contract was approved on a 4-to-1 vote on the 4th hearing. In 2005, former police chief and then Mayor Potter took Portland out of the JTTF due to concerns he could not oversee the officers taking part due to security clearance issues. Predictably, Portland rejoined the JTTF in early 2011, shortly after the FBI coordinated a sting operation against Mohammed Mahmoud, a teenager who the FBI led to believe was going to attack Pioneer Courthouse Square. Starting in 2012, the city required annual reports. Those were heard 3 times. Once the report barely was accepted due to its threadbare nature on a 3-2 vote. The next year, council had the Bureau go back to fix the report between the 2 weeks meetings before accepting it. We appreciate the new report was held back this year to add much needed details. The original draft only had a few footnotes to indicate the full nature of the cases the Portland police sent to the FBI. However, even with a longer report, there's no context for why they thought a person who set the police association headquarters on fire needed to be investigated as a terrorist, or for that matter, the person who fired a gun at the federal building, or a person who broke glass on the federal building. While these are indeed criminal acts, they could have been, should have been, and were investigated as such. It's not clear that the PPAD has a clear definition of terrorism. It's also good the original last 2 pages of the report were pulled out because they speculated about the dangers that may exist after the U.S. pulled its troops out of Afghanistan. That kind of language is unnecessarily alarmist and raises questions about the Criminal Intelligence Unit's objectivity. It's also worth noting the only case the FBI referred to the PPB in 2021 was a non-existent threat to a school, and the case which was deferred from last report had to do with a text message threat to a religious leader that was turned over to authorities in Florida, which Sergeant Simpson only just explained why that happened. Just now, it's not in the report. In general, our groups continue to urge the council to keep the Portland Police from working under the JTTF, while cooperation with federal agents would obviously be necessary if a federal criminal act were to occur in Portland. If you do not sever ties more clearly, these reports need to both delve deeper into the crimes being sent between the agencies and ensure there will not be more of the alarmist tone meant to justify continuing the security state that's been on steroids since 9/11 of 2011. We should also fix the part that calls this a presentation so that the public can continue to testify. And we also had questions about the PPB's cooperation with the State Fusion Center that weren't answered in the report. Thank you very much.
Next up, we have Debbie Kay.
Good morning, Mayor Wheeler, Commissioners Hardesty, Rubio, Mapps, and Ryan. Thank you very much for the opportunity to address you today. I am Debbie Kay, President of the League of Women Voters of Portland. My pronouns are she and her. The League of Women Voters first commented on the city's involvement with the JTTF in 2001 and has shared our views on the issue with you throughout these ensuing years. We appreciate the opportunity to provide oral testimony on the report once again. Our democracy is strengthened and sustained by active and informed participation in government. Participation can take many forms, from voting to testifying before a decision-making body, such as this one, or joining in a demonstration. The freedom to express one's political views is threatened when people feel they have to look over their shoulders because they fear they may be targets for government surveillance or FBI files. In Oregon, we are fortunate that state law prohibits the collection and maintenance of information related to First Amendment activities unless there are reasonable grounds to suspect that an individual is or may be involved in criminal conduct. On the other hand, FBI actions in Oregon and around the country raise concerns that those protections may be ignored when Portland police work with federal agents. Specific instances in recent years of FBI tracking and surveillance of Muslims and climate change, Palestinian solidarity, and Black activists underscore the reasons for community concern. Furthermore, these revelations can and do have a chilling effect on public involvement, activism, and lawful dissent. In the interest of making Portland a place where community members are free to act without fear, the League encourages the city to end its case-by-case participation with the with the FBI, and in the future, work with them only when necessary to pursue legitimate criminal actions. Finally, we appreciate the additional information incorporated in the amended JTTF report, and it certainly gives the public a better picture of how the Bureau and the FBI are working together. If Council decides to maintain the status quo, future annual reports should be required at a minimum to contain the same type of information as the amended report, including responses to City Council questions. You will find links to relevant news articles in our written testimony submission. And again, we truly appreciate the opportunity to provide oral testimony this year. Thank you very much.
That completes testimony.
Very good. Thank you to everybody who testified. Colleagues, at this point, we'll entertain any questions that anybody has. Alternatively, I'll entertain a motion to accept the report. Commissioner Ryan.
Yeah, hi, this is a question. Good morning, Mayor. This is a question for Chief LaBelle. You're still in the meeting, right?
I am.
There he is. All right. Good morning, Chief LaBelle. Hey, I'm curious about this, and I struggle to see it in ways that I'd like. Has the information from the JTTF shifted focus to the reality that our biggest threat is domestic terrorism?
You know, it's really for us based on the referrals we get. And like Sergeant Simpson pointed out, we only got one from them last year. Imagine it's very possible the focus could shift and the cases could be different depending on what they come across that has a nexus to the city of Portland. But as we know, we've seen a shift in just kind of the focus and the things that are important in the community. And we as an organization are trying to be, responsive to what the community's wishes are around investigating and reporting around the JTTF work.
Thank you, Chief. Sergeant Simpson, do you have anything to add to that? Because it's just so obvious to anyone that that's where the biggest threat is.
Yes, Commissioner, that's a good question. All of the cases that were referred back and forth last year would all fall under the domestic terrorism umbrella. And that is consistent with the past several years and consistent with everything that I've seen in a supervisory role over this cooperation agreement. Because we're not a full partner, we don't get involved generally in cases outside the city of Portland, but you do have Clackamas County, Washington County, and the Port of Portland and the state police are all partners on the JTTF. I would characterize a significant amount of that work would also fall under the domestic terrorism umbrella. Other JTTFs around the country have different issues because of different challenges in their communities, but certainly here in Oregon, you are 100% right that is, from our lens, the number one concern. And it's reflected in the work that we have done over the past 3 years.
Thank you, Sergeant Simpson. That was helpful. Thanks.
Commissioner Mapps.
Yeah, this is maybe a question for Sergeant Simpson. When I look at the cases that the PPB referred to the FBI, for the most part, they seem to deal with bomb threats and death threats. And I was wondering why those particular cases were sending to the FBI. And if we didn't refer them to the FBI, how else might we handle them?
Sure. With regard to bomb threats, one of the things that falls under the umbrella of the Joint Terrorism Task Force is weapons of mass destruction or explosive related cases. So a bomb threat might not be considered terrorism under the definition, but it falls under the workflow of the JTTF. So in keeping with the spirit and the letter of the resolution, if we are sending a bomb threat case to the FBI, JTTF, we're going to include it here. Certainly there can be some that are both. A bomb threat based on ideology, for example, might fall under the definition of terrorism, or trying to enact change or change government or force government to do things. Other threats, it depends on how they come in and what they're about. Some threats, for example, conveyed person to person, generally aren't violating any federal statutes. But if a threat is sent through social media, for example, there are particular federal statutes that apply to those threats. Some cases go to the hate crimes at the FBI, which are not JTTF cases. They investigate separately. So a little bit of it is where the cases end up. We want to make sure that we're accurately reporting that to you and tracking it accordingly.
Thank you. And one last question on my part. I think we have 7 cases that we referred to the FBI. Have any civil liberty issues or concerns been raised about those cases that you know of?
Not to my knowledge. There are some cases that is a question that has to be asked and answered. For example, is a statement protected by the First Amendment, or has it crossed the line into criminal behavior? And that doesn't matter if it's state or federal. We have the same guidelines. All of these cases, at least at the outset, had a reasonable grounds that there had been a crime or a crime was being planned. And that's really where we have to start our investigations.
Commissioner Hardesty.
Thank you, Mayor. Sergeant Simpson, I'm curious as I review the cases, is there, let me back up. Is there a criteria under which a threat on social media against an elected official you would automatically send to the Joint Terrorism Task Force?
Yeah, it depends on the nature. Well, so it has to be criminal, first of all. And that there's a lot of things said on social media that as a receiver, you would feel threatened by, but to cross the criminal line, we have to determine, is there a state crime violation or a federal crime violation? And each case is unique. The case that there is one case here, threat of targeted violence to an elected official was a threat posted on social media to the mayor. That case was referred because it did cross that criminal threshold, but ultimately the case remained with PPB and was indicted by the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office because it was a better venue to pursue the prosecution versus the federal side. So it depends, I guess is the best way to say it, and how it's delivered.
And where is that decision made? Is that made before you contact the JTTF, or is that a decision that's made in partnership with the JTTF?
The decision to send the case?
The decision to, yes, to send it, to take it seriously and actually do something about it.
Again, I think it depends. Generally, if we take a police report, a police officer takes a report and we review it, we will make that sort of determination is what's the best venue for this, or does it meet the criteria to go to JTTF, or does it meet the criteria to go to a different agency? For example, a social media threat to the president would not go to JTTF, that would go to the Secret Service for protection. So it starts with us really looking at it, and not every case goes that way. We can investigate those as well. It depends on the nature and what we can figure out about the suspect involved.
One last question. What is different in how Portland Police Bureau engages with the JTTF prior to 2019, February 2019, when we officially voted to pull out of the Joint Terrorism Task Force? I think there are a lot of people who have different understandings of what is allowed and what isn't. And can you succinctly say what was different after we voted to pull out of the Joint Terrorism Task Force?
The main difference is prior to 2019, we had the ability to assign 2 officers full-time to work at the FBI, sit at a desk, and work with the task force. And I mentioned earlier, the task force is made up of multi-agencies. So you have state police, Washington County, Clackamas County, Port of Portland, and the FBI. So you're looking at a much larger investigative area that our officers could be involved with. Now we, through the resolution, we restricted it to threats in or about the city of Portland, and we don't have people assigned there every day. So
actually, I disagree with your assessment of what we did. What we did was pull out of the Joint Terrorism Task Force and set criteria that said the chief or the deputy chief would determine whether or not a Portland police officer would engage with the JTTF. Is that an accurate statement?
Yes. And what I'm explaining is that we don't participate in all those things that I mentioned earlier prior to 2019. We can only, within the parameters of the resolution, work on Portland-based cases, again, that meet all the criteria. So it is a much different landscape for us to work now than it was prior to 2019.
I just want to make sure that that is on the public record, that it is not your decision. It is the chief or the deputy chief that actually is the ultimate decision maker about whether or not we trade information with the Joint Terrorism Task Force. Words are very powerful. So it sounds like the police bureau is actually had evolved rather than actually the council evolved and put very strict criteria under which how we would engage with the Joint Terrorism Task Force. I think that's why I said at the beginning, it's important to put the history in there, because as people retire, the institutional history gets lost, and then the narrative changes, and the narrative actually is not an accurate narrative. And so I just want to make sure that people keep remembering why we're here, what we did to get here, and what the expectations are. So thank you very much. I really appreciate the conversation, and I appreciate the openness to making this report more useful and more user-friendly for the community who still has concerns about how deeply engaged we are, especially after the summer of 2020, with so many outstanding questions still out there. So I appreciate you being here today. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. Does that complete questions? And if so, I'll entertain a motion.
Mayor, I move we adopt the revised JTTF report as presented.
We have a motion from Commissioner Hardesty. Commissioner Ryan, was that you seconding? Yes. Yes. Commissioner Ryan seconds. Any further discussion? Keelan, please call the roll.
Rubio.
Thank you, Chief Lavelle and Sergeant Simpson for the presentation today. And I want to really thank the mayor and chief for taking the additional time to amend the report and to ensure council received the additional information that we requested on behalf of the community. I greatly appreciate that responsiveness. I also want to appreciate the public's concern and their testimonies today. The JTTF relationship has been one that I've followed for many years, predating my time on council, first as a staff to Mayor Tom Potter, and then as executive director of a nonprofit serving immigrant and Latinx communities. And we worked in partnership with civil rights advocates also to both ensure the preservation of civil liberties and also that Black, Indigenous, people of color, and immigrant communities wouldn't be harmed by any joint actions taken under JTTF. And that concern is still in the community today. Portlanders then and now have an expectation of transparency about this initiative. And moving forward, I'm also interested in updating or taking a look at the 2019 council resolution to better reflect today's prevalence of white nationalist terrorism that we've heard about today, and also include the amended information that we've asked for and that we know that we want to know on an ongoing basis in order to satisfy the public's interest and to build trust there. I think that taking this additional step will provide the clarity that the Bureau needs in order to respond to us. And accordingly will help ensure that we as a council set up the Bureau for success in this and ensure that council has the information we need to make sound decisions. And also that we ensure transparency and accountability to the public. So in this spirit of collaboration and future work, I vote aye to accept this report.
Ryan.
Thank you. Thank you, Chief Lavelle and Sergeant Simpson. I too really appreciate you being here today and the openness and definitely taking a breath on this and amending the report. And thank you, Mayor, for that amendment to the process, if you will. Colleagues, when this report on Joint Terrorism Task Force was delivered to us a few weeks ago, I thought back to last year's discussions on the same topic. I distinctly remember having conversations with some of you in which you told me that you had requested additional information from the Portland Police Bureau on any potential interactions between the police, Portland Police, and FBI during the 2020 protest. In my remarks last year, I spoke to the troubled history this entity has had with our community and the need for transparency and accountability. I really appreciate the testimony today when there was a theme on this topic. Thank you all for coming. It is for this reason that my staff and I have worked extensively with you and all of your staff to advocate for an amended Joint Terrorism Task Force report that included such information. And I appreciate our conversation that we had last week on this topic, Chief Lavelle. Thank you. And while the amended language doesn't provide the level of detail the community has requested, and for that matter, nor would I like, That said, I appreciate that our questions were at least acknowledged and answered in some capacity. I'm grateful to have been able to engage with many of you on this issue over the past week, and at some point I would love to engage with you all in dialogue about how we can expand the scope of this report. I believe it's in the public interest to get as much information as possible about the workings of law enforcement locally. Such transparency will only serve to build public trust at a time in which we need it most. And we're also at a time when organized crime is more complex and goes well beyond local. So I see the value in coordinated intelligence. It is my hope that we can make changes to this report that will serve these goals. In faith that we keep improving, I vote aye.
Hardesty.
First, let me thank my colleagues, Commissioner Ryan and Commissioner Rubio, for really taking a deep dive into this report and really asking the right questions so that we were given additional time. And I want to thank you, Mayor, for your responsiveness, as well as you, Chief LaBelle, for really being open, hearing about how do we make this better. It is clear that in 2018, when I was running for this seat, I heard from primarily communities of color, immigrant and refugee communities, their fear about how the Joint Tourism Task Force was using information to target community members. I made it a commitment when I was elected that I would work to pull us out of the Joint Tourism Task Force. And as you notice today, language is really important because we didn't negotiate a deal. We pulled out of the Joint Tourism Task Force with few exceptions. And those exceptions can only be approved by the chief or the deputy chief. And so I am concerned that the report, it actually kind of implies information that really isn't so. And so I'm looking forward to working with the Police Bureau to really make this report more reflective of the reasoning behind why we pulled out of the Joint Tourism Task Force. And honestly, this rise in white supremacy and white nationalism that I don't know what police agency actually is leading any changes around that, but it's been woefully underreported. And I know for communities of color, that is the biggest threat we face is of white nationalists and white supremacists terrorizing our community, as they did last August. And still, we're waiting for a report about how they were allowed to actually terrorize East Portland last August. So I'm saying all this to say is that I appreciate Chief LaBelle and Deputy Chief Fromm's openness to continuing to be better and progress improvements. We have a lot of improvements that we need to make and making sure that the community continues to trust the information that they receive from this report and other reports from the city. So I vote aye, and I look forward to the next report being better than this one.
Maps.
Aye.
Wheeler.
Thank you, Chief LaBelle. Thank you, Sergeant Simpson. I vote aye. The report is received and accepted. And that concludes our business for this morning. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, everybody who testified.